Okay. I mean, this week's is all Howard Tompkins, really, isn't it, Sarah?
Yeah, I have prepared presentation. I think Dan, is he? Yeah, Dan, hi. So some bits of Litchfield's input as well.
Okay, so I mean, if everybody's here, I don't think we need to do introductions again, do we? There's no new faces.
No, I think we know each other.
Yeah. Okay, let's get on with it then. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you. Can everyone see my screen? Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. So we're meeting 3. Public and community benefits. I'll keep it kind of hopefully to time. We've got setting out the benefits of proposals, describing the community and affordable workspaces, the landscape and public realm, and the graffiti and ball court kind of proposals and overview. So I think it kind of makes sense as one presentation, so I'll keep going, and then we can kind of revisit it rather than kind of deal with it in chunks. But if you kind of want to interject at any point, of course you're more than welcome to. So I think to start out with the requirements, so of the alternative kind of use options, so the public benefits and the landscape, kind of why are these kind of required to be delivered as part of the scheme? So I don't know if Dan, you're best to kind of summarise on the policy and the statutory kind of feedback elements of that.
Yeah, so both the local plan 2019 and the Trellic and Eden SPD 2015 both have the requirement for improvements to the public realm and open spaces around the site, and the 2015 SPD that's captured within design objective 2, which goes into a lot more detail of the different types of facilities and spaces that could be provided, and that's been mirrored in our feedback from the planning department to date, which is obviously in line with that policy, and they've emphasised the importance of a landscape-led approach on the site, which addresses the factors outlined in policy and that on the site in general at the moment. So circulation, accessibility for all people, level differences across the site, providing types of spaces for different users and age groups, particularly play space, and obviously the feeling of safety, lighting and overlooking. The heritage perspective of having an open space in front of the Trellic Tower. And then obviously feedback that's come through from public consultations so far, which are kind of outlined there, and not particularly surprising in terms of what people want on the site in terms of green space and play area, and obviously the graffiti space as well. And then the ball court, which the planners kind of reserved their position on to start with, and we said that we, as a first round of consultation, would see the importance of that. And obviously it's come back as a strong requirement from the local community to retain or re-provide the ball court. And then, well, actually, Sarah, I'll hand back over to you on the structural condition of the podium.
Yeah, just another kind of side consideration is the structural consideration of the podium space itself, and the kind of the requirement for investment there, which kind of ties in a bit. Dan, I don't know if you mentioned it kind of under the local plan, also the additional social and community uses. So not only the public realm kind of benefits, but the
yeah, so that there's a requirement in policy to provide community use as part of any development. I think it actually it doesn't specify a particular use, and in discussions with the planners so far, that the priority for them on any space to be provided is to make sure that there is a demand for the space, and that we're not re-providing a use which exists already that would never be occupied. And that's been the focus of the work we've been doing so far in terms of reviewing existing community uses in and around the local area, and obviously something that we've invited feedback on in the second round of consultation on the type of uses people would want to see on the site. And similarly, we'd obviously welcome any suggestions from Comet. I think Sarah's going to go into detail later in the presentation about the type, the size of the space. So suggestions from Comet on uses, tenants, any sort of proposals for the space will be welcome. But I think I'll touch on that.
Can I just clarify something before we move on from this slide?
Yeah,
these things on this slide, these points 1 to 4, these are all planning requirements, are they?
Yeah, so that was what I was going to go on to, because that was one of the questions kind of Magda had forwarded onto this. So the kind of the planning requirements kind of set out the local plan and the SPD. The statutory feedback, obviously, kind of, I mean, our conversations with the planners have kind of like a residential only scheme would not be acceptable to them. It doesn't fulfill the kind of the wider kind of planning requirements. It can't just be housing and kind of no other works, and they're keen for non-residential uses to kind of be delivered as part of the scheme. The ball court and the graffiti spaces, the ball court is a kind of a GLA, it's almost a requirement from their perspective that they'd see that space re-provided, like sports facilities as a principle, to be re-provided. So the graffiti as kind of an element is the one that's kind of, I guess, driven by, obviously strongly driven by kind of public consultation feedback, but isn't a statutory kind of requirement.
Yeah, and from the planning side, obviously we're trying to develop a scheme that meets the planning policy, so what's set out in planning policy, so to include those within the scheme. And it's up to then, once any application is submitted, for the planning department of the council to determine the degree to which our scheme meets that. So by not providing those, we're reducing the likelihood that they would approve it, if that makes sense.
Can I ask a question about the definition of what are community uses? So would a doctor's surgery be a community use, for example?
That is one. Well, it covers a whole wide range. The use class is really flexible now. There's been amendments to it recently, but yeah, a surgery would come under it, but that's driven more by demand and capacity from the NHS side of re-provision of those facilities. What the council on the planning side have been driving us more towards is a community use, in the sense that it serves the local community, not necessarily, like, it could potentially be healthcare, but more in terms of serving a need in the local community that's identified.
Well, that sounds like healthcare could very much be that.
Yeah, potentially.
I mean, there is a requirement in the 2019 local plan specifically for this site for there to be a healthcare facility, I think.
Yeah, I think it's community use, including healthcare provision. Yeah, so social and community uses, including healthcare provision. But the planners, at the same time, they're monitoring so there's not over provision of health facility, or that we don't provide a health facility that the NHS would never then occupy, and it becomes a kind of white elephant that you have this part of the scheme that there's not a demand for, being driven by the commissioning group at the NHS.
Could I just interject there? Might help a little bit. Well, we acknowledge that there has been a need in the area for a while for improved medical facilities, and we are, as I think we've mentioned before, in very active discussions with the NHS about where that could go, which may well be, for example, in discussion with them about. And if, very simply put, if they did that, then they wouldn't be able to justify having additional medical accommodation on the Edenham site. So it's one or the other. And at the moment, the route that they're going is ground floor space on Kensal Road, although obviously that's still to be completely finalised. So that probably helps you a little bit in terms of that context.
Just another question on community use. Would a supermarket be community use?
No.
No.
That's retail.
Retail, yeah.
Okay. We can always come back to this if there are further questions.
Large supermarket.
And I think that when the next point is obviously the broader kind of concern of placemaking and kind of creating successful places, social infrastructure, hard and kind of soft infrastructure, facilities and things like that do kind of create places, and what's, I guess, so successful about the existing estate as it is, and what we've kind of discussed as its value. So these kind of non-residential uses, outdoor spaces that people can use that are inclusive, as part of the design brief, and how the design kind of develops, being kind of a consideration and kind of support for these parts of the brief. So alternative use options that we've discussed in different kind of conversations, live work, so different typologies of live work uses, affordable employment and enterprise space, and community spaces. There are obviously existing kind of community uses on the site, like the base of kind of Trellic's block A and B, and as well as kind of commercial spaces that are successful and kind of used, and some kind of redundant spaces there as well. But we've kind of discussed all these and kind of looking for the right fit. I think the key thing is that whatever is provided on the site is viable, and there's what kind of work going on, as Dan says, to establish kind of what the need is, and what types of uses will be kind of suitable and applicable.
Why do you say affordable employment enterprise spaces? Why isn't this revenue generating?
Martin or Dan, is that something you want to pick up?
Right, I think Tony or Kevin, I'm not sure who asked the question. We're not really saying that it should be, shouldn't pay a revenue, but I think the idea is that it should be local enterprise driven. It benefits the local community, and on that basis, it may be, if we were able to secure a rent, it wouldn't actually be a full.
But I guess I'm just asking why not? I mean, after all, you've got some market rent housing in the development.
I guess your point is that
Sorry, Martin, we're really struggling to. Is anyone else struggling to?
I guess the point you're saying, Tony, is if you had a
yes,
tenant paying.
No, sorry, I've got a really bad connection. I apologise.
If you had a tenant paying a high rent, it might help subsidise other parts of the scheme. But then I guess the question that the council would be asking is, if that's a commercial tenant who's not actually contributing back to the community use, not back to the community, is it then a community use if it's just a standard commercial tenant? I guess the point of the affordable or enterprise space is that it would be offering potentially discounted rents to encourage local enterprises and community users of it, which then is a benefit locally. And I guess once you see that
the is a benefit locally, right? I mean, Innocent up the road, I'm sure, pay full whack for their offices, and they provide local benefit by stimulating the local economy.
But that's an ancillary benefit. If it was an office space and it was people commuting from outside the borough to go to the office space, then it wouldn't be a benefit to the local community.
Well, look, we're going to disagree as to what a benefit is, but having economic activity, people at lunchtime, all the activity that employees bring, it seems to me is a benefit to the local community. But maybe we'll disagree about that.
Tony, I think we philosophically and commercially, we entirely agree with your position on that, and we understand the point you're making. I think it's more of how we're restricted by some of the restrictions that the planners may look at this, and how that then translates itself into a tenant that actually is long-term and sustainable as well.
So, like Innocent.
Innocent, I don't think would take that space anyway at the moment. But I mean, there are other people who we will do some proper market testing to see what sort of occupiers we could attract to that location, taking the point that you're raising.
Great, thanks.
So kind of onto describing the spaces, obviously kind of our planning discussions, and this is just a recap from some of the slides we showed in the first set in the first meeting. So they're kind of transforming the site and the opportunity to reuse the redundant spaces at the base of Trellic Block A, to create a kind of an active entrance point kind of at that gable end and at that kind of that junction up to Meanwell Road at the base of the service yard, and they're transforming the service yard itself into this kind of active and that active Muse Street, with the destination kind of at the end, the activity provided in that space by the entrance to kind of a significant whatever space that it ends up being, and that entrance kind of point, and that the kind of the node of activity at that site being really important in the ability to kind of transform and recast the service yard, creating a kind of successful kind of piece of the estate and public realm that's currently kind of quite problematic. We've obviously covered all that already, but just to kind of emphasize again, the planners support kind of for that as a site strategy, and that kind of underpinning that activity in that location, which obviously isn't kind of suitable for residential but needs to be addressed.
Sorry, can I jump in and ask a question? Several times today you've referred to the planners. Who are the planners?
Well, Dan's probably best answered, but RBKC, so the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, their planning department, we've been working kind of very closely with their kind of senior team there. That would be who I.
But wait, do I just get this straight? The decision makers here are the politicians, correct?
The planning department are the decision makers, so they would recommend any application for approval or refusal. It would then be put to planning committee, where it's then voted on by the politicians. But in the planning department determine the application, so we engage with them at the pre-application stage to ascertain whether what elements of the proposals they would support or wouldn't support, and that's influenced the development of the design, because they're the ones that adjudicate whether any scheme complies with planning policy, which then dictates whether it can be approved or refused.
And do they take instruction from the political representatives?
No, it's a separate planning and I mean, I say it here, it might not necessarily. Planning and politics are separate. So whether this scheme complies with planning policy isn't a political determination, it's a planning determination. So if we, for instance, the point about providing a minimum of 60 residential units, if you didn't provide a minimum of 60 residential units, you wouldn't be in compliance with that element of the planning policy. So that's not a political point, that's a planning determination. The council, as a determining planning body, have to determine an application against the statutory planning policy context, and politics has no role in whether it complies with that or not.
And then the planning committee can so the planners are a gating requirement, but the planning committee is not under any obligation to accept anything that the planning department has proposed.
So they could approve or refuse an application, but if they refuse an application on grounds that aren't in accordance with the planning policy, then you'd be at risk that an appeal would then overturn that decision. So their decision to approve an application could be based on personal political or party political grounds, but if the reasons for refusing it aren't actually based on planning policy, then yeah, there's a risk of appeal.
And appeal by the developer, or by who in this case?
Where it would be by the council. So it would then go to the planning inspectorate, who are a separate body. I'm not saying
who would be appealing in this case. So the planning committee turn it down. Would it be the planning department at the council who would be appealing it?
No. So, well, I'm not saying there would be an appeal, but if it were, it would be the applicant side of the council. So the new homes side would appeal, and it then, depending on what
the council officials would appeal against council elected representatives.
Yeah, Tony, I don't think it would ever actually get to that stage. I'm not aware of any council. Politically, it would just make no sense.
Yes. Sorry, I'm just explaining. Yeah, I'm explaining in terms of the planning, the process involved, not necessarily that it would. Yeah, sorry, just to clarify that, I'm not saying that that's the case. Of just setting out the procedure involved.
Thank you for the clarification.
Great. So the point about activating the base of Trellic Tower and transforming these redundant spaces. So we've seen this kind of image as part of the kind of public consultation, but just to kind of describe it in more detail, kind of how we see this space kind of potentially working. So I don't know if you've had access to the existing garages. There are 3 levels of that space beneath Trellic, 2 of which we kind of consider that could be kind of potentially habitable in this manner. So this drawing illustrated kind of stripping out all the kind of non-structural walls, not affecting the kind of the structure of the base of that tower, and creating this atrium kind of in front of it, lit from above, and that enables those spaces to be inhabited, and whether they're kind of, I mean, at the moment kind of we're kind of in very early stage, and it would be really good to kind of discuss with Comet and kind of any suggestions, I think, about potential uses for that space, and the kind of ideas people have about how it could work, but just a kind of an impression of what that kind of space could be suitable for, or kind of organizations within the local community that we've kind of been speaking with as well. A few precedents kind of the kind of character and nature of that, and to give a sense of scale. So there's a plan there, which is probably quite illegible, but kind of, yeah, over 2 levels, the purple area kind of being the in community and employment space. We also have within our red line that kind of that end unit of block B, the basement space there that's beneath the GP surgery. Quite nicely kind of architecturally, I guess those 2 entrances kind of in dialogue across the end of the Mews, kind of really activating kind of that point at the base of the service tower.
Sorry, did you just say beneath the GP surgery?
Yes.
Which GP surgery?
That's a bit confusing, Tony. It was a GP surgery. They moved out a little while ago. It's been vacated, and it will now be a commercial use of the ground floor, not a GP surgery.
Apologies. The original GP surgery on that corner, I don't know if you know, the kind of, it's still got the lettering. That's kind of what we're referring to it as. But yeah, that basement space, so the space that's below it, accessed from the Mews, is within our kind of our scope. There'll be a kind of a secondary entrance, which would mean there's kind of an accessible external entrance at both levels, from the eastern kind of side, from that link up to Meanwhile Gardens, again kind of overlooking that kind of key, quite tricky space on the site, from a kind of site strategy point of view. There's a view there of the entrance kind of at the end of the Mews. Obviously the architectural kind of language is emerging, and these are kind of very diagrammatic at this stage, but the principle of kind of activity and kind of creating an entrance in that space, and what that might start to look like. In the bottom left, there's obviously the kind of the existing condition, and in replacing that podium, like what's the opportunity there. And then reversing kind of back out, so the kind of that view down the Mews, where you can see the kind of community spaces either side at the end as the kind of the beacon that really draws you along and activates that space.
Can I just ask, just to clarify something? So in this proposal, there would be residential housing on the right of that picture where you're hovering the mouse now, yeah? Yes. And then the stuff underneath the what remains of the podium where the car park was, that would be the kind of commercial stroke community space. Yes. And what would be on the left of this Mews Street? Yeah, there, exactly.
So those are the existing spaces kind of that currently kind of serve the shops above. Yeah. I guess the idea of kind of creating this new street and character is that other uses kind of could come forward in that space that are more active. There's obviously a mixture of kind of, I think Goldfinger Workshop used their space beneath for more than just storage, and it's a more kind of active and engaged use, but the idea that they could be open onto that Mews and it could have a real kind of mixed character is kind of part of the the concept here.
But we're not talking about turning that left-hand side of the proposed Mews Street into residential.
No, not.
Okay, great, thanks.
So it's a mixed-use street. Like I guess that's the kind of where the Mews typology kind of comes from. It's serving, but it's also kind of residential. It's a mixture. And then to the right, those are kind of family units that open up kind of onto the square, but their entrance and their kind of activity, their front doors is along that street, and obviously transforming it in terms of the public realm, the safety and security kind of a surface that is kind of and more comfortable for pedestrians and all that kind of thing, rather than kind of car dominated as it currently is. But I think within that entrance to it, obviously kind of retaining the drama and the structure of those walls and those curved bridges and those kind of heritage assets, and using them kind of in a different way. So but anyway, hopefully that's a kind of, I mean, that's an artist's impression kind of obviously at this stage of what that could kind of start to feel like. So just to summarize in terms of the uses, red being residential, so we've kind of got our 5 residential blocks around the square. and the kind of community commercial workshop kind of type spaces in the blue. So to summarize the kind of the diagram here.
Sorry, what's home studio? Should I know that already? Have we been through that?
Oh, no, we haven't actually. That's a really good point. So the other kind of idea we were thinking about and kind of talking with the planners about how you can activate some of these kind of key routes and spaces through kind of more than residential. So having kind of perhaps larger, more active kind of units along kind of Mima Way, which is a key route, might give those kind of a different character, be more suitable to kind of the grounding of that particular building and provide more activity and kind of character on that street. So it's just an idea that we're kind of exploring currently.
Kind of live workspace.
That kind of thing. So it's all kind of in development, but that as a concept. So I'll move on to speak about the kind of the public realm and amenity. So this is the kind of the diagram, the overview of kind of the scheme and the different kind of landscape spaces that we are kind of considering. So it's a holistic, it's a kind of transformation of the whole site kind of within the red line. At the heart of it, Edenham Garden, and then these various kind of subsidiary spaces. In terms of quantum, I think this is also kind of been clear before, but the existing kind of area of the ball court and the amenity space, 2,200 square meters, and the kind of the proposed area, the whole entire kind of site area, public realm, so that's excluding the kind of building footprints, 6,500 meters squared, and Edenham Gardens itself an increase kind of to 2,500 meters squared. So we talked about that kind of a bit last week in terms of the kind of the quantum and the kind of areas that we were delivering. I've put this in terms of, I think, I mean, I'd be keen for some more feedback and discussion about kind of these routes and spaces and the nature of them, particularly kind of Edenham Way and the kind of the route up to Meanwhile Gardens, to have a conversation about kind of how you imagine kind of those routes and spaces being used and kind of in what way. I think that's definitely, I mean, obviously we touched on it in kind of the feedback for the consultation, and to have that kind of discussion would be, I know, really helpful kind of from a design perspective in developing the scheme. A diagram which, this is a diagram by landscape architects kind of attempting to clarify on the complex level changes in the site and the strategy for how we kind of mitigate them. Obviously the nature of the site is it is kind of over 3 levels, so we kind of have been, yeah, the kind of the G-2, the very kind of lower ball court level, the Eden Way level, and then the Elkstone Road level. So it's a complex kind of site to work with from that respect, and kind of one of our strategies being to make as much of the space inclusive and accessible as possible, routes that are kind of that work to kind of link those spaces together. So I'll just flip quickly through some kind of site sections, which we can linger in more detail if we want to at a later point, but just kind of showing how we're attempting to kind of mitigate them and kind of link the spaces together to create kind of something that's quite coherent and accessible through kind of gradual changes in level rather than particular steps. Obviously, so this top one here kind of cuts through the square and then up to Meanwhile Gardens. Obviously there's a significant kind of level change there, which isn't kind of a ramped access kind of from the square. The inclusive route kind of brings you round the top of Meanwhile Way. That's a significant kind of change there. But a couple of other kind of an east-west and a north-south section.
Oh, I haven't got my walking stick anymore.
Right, Keith.
Whoever's host should mute Keith for his own sake.
Okay. Yeah, a couple of other site sections. Oh, I've lost my ability to flick to. And then, so here's a kind of an impression of the kind of, just to hopefully gives a sense of this, the character and scale of that space and the level of enclosure that's kind of proposed. Obviously, I mean, from an architectural perspective, kind of, and a heritage perspective, kind of providing that space of that sense of space in front of in front of the south facade of Trellic as a counterpoint to its kind of monumentality is a really important thing. But just starting to think about actually how that space can be used, how it can kind of tie together, how it can be permeated by these roots, and what that can look and feel like, and how it can best serve the community. And that's what we've kind of, the use of that space. This is the kind of questions that we've asked in the public consultation, like how would it best be used? And I know that obviously the landscape kind of consultants are very much looking for that feedback to determine the design of that space. So kind of movement, play, meeting, socialization, different age groups, is growing space something that kind of the community would have a need and a use for. So very much looking for kind of feedback and thoughts and suggestions about that. So then we've got the kind of topics of the ball court, so the existing space that's provided in the heart of the site. And the kind of two suggestions that we've put forward, but that one kind of being to integrate something within the main garden that would something, or utilize kind of the area to the north of Trellic in a kind of quite a comprehensive kind of visiting of that part of the site. Could that also incorporate kind of a kind of specific and designated space? But it's also kind of again another question to kind of to put to you in this kind of forum that would be useful. What's the nature of this space that we're trying to provide? What is it that the community need particularly? Is it something kind of a specific ball court? Is it something that needs to be managed? Is it kind of an enclosed and really kind of specific space, or is it something kind of integrated, more open, that can be kind of used more informally? And then there's the discussion with the graffiti writers and the kind of the nature of the existing kind of graffiti space. We've gone through this kind of I guess in quite a lot of detail kind of previously, but the proposals that we kind of put forward of how that space could be re-provided, we understand kind of quite clearly now the kind of characteristics that the graffiti writers need and are looking for. And then there's an additional kind of study that is currently kind of we're working on, looking at the options to kind of retain the existing walls and what that would mean for the kind of the development of the site, and the issues kind of and opportunities that there are kind of surrounding that. So I think that, how did I do for time, Patrick? Is that okay?
That was perfect. Thank you, Sarah. Questions?
I think we're feeling slightly uneasy. Maybe James can open up, because we have problems with the process at this point. James, why don't you kick off?
Yeah, so this we have a few concerns that we sort of wanted on the record, because this term co-design is being used a lot in council communications to this point. And we just wanted, for the record, to elaborate a definition of what we perceive that to be, quite simply, and where we feel that this a process needs to deviate from the situation we're presently in. So, to us, co-design is a process that puts community interests and voices at the heart of a design process that is phased and gradual and considered, and it cultivates a space where time is taken to listen and really understand who and what the community are about. And through that process of listening, it engenders trust. So, but what isn't co-design? And this community here, right, does not presume or wish to replace the expertise of any professional services employed by the council. That's not what we're about. But the community has significant experience about this place. And I think that's really important in that it's complementary, not in place of professional knowledge. And so we've written quite a long piece on what we believe co-design to be, and we'll submit this afterwards, but there's three key areas which I think are really important, which haven't been defined yet. And the community feels that, one, we should define and agree what the core issues are and write them down as a term of reference, because presently we're being the community feels that it's being given proposals that are sink or swim on the basis of passive consultation measures. For example, at no point in the presentation today was there ever a process where this is an option of many. I don't think the community has been involved in a staged optioneering process. It's only been told that options have been considered and then one option will be presented. And I think if we embed community voices within a phase design process, you'll find that the outcomes are far more successful and less combative than what they are at this point. So if council communications are going to use this term, I think we as a community or us as community representatives should be given the opportunity to put a definition of what that term is and enact a framework to ensure that co-design, as quoted, does go on. Because a steering group is fantastic and we feel this is the first step in pretty much in phase one, which is defining the issues. And I think we've defined them in terms of we have a position on the graffiti wall, we have a position on how the landscape should be used. But then the community needs to be able to feel empowered to influence design as it goes on. And I think that needs to be a bit more phased. But I won't grumble on anymore, but we've written down a term of reference. It's one page, and we think it would be very useful to understand if a framework like this could be implemented in the next phase of design.
And I think that, you know, part of the unease that we're feeling here is that the process that we seem to be engaged in is one in which you're presenting the design as it is now, as you've developed it, and you're kind of sequentially asking for feedback. Now, the trouble with sequential feedback is it's like it's a salami slice tactic, right? You know, what we absolutely don't want is to start a conversation about this current set of public realm proposals in giving any credence to the idea that we think that the framework within which it's being done is right, because we don't. We think that the scheme needs a fundamental rethink, in particular in terms of density. And if you rethink the scheme in terms of density and in terms of preserving some key aspects like the graffiti wall, then there's no point in engaging at this level of detail, right? This is jumping the gun, we feel, this level of discussion. And I'm not quite sure how we get around this, right? Because we can't comment in detail about what you've talked to us here, because we don't think it's the right starting point.
I think that's right, Tony. I just wanted to add, when I was listening to you, Sarah, describing the Muse Street and the combination of residential and maybe commercials or social spaces, I was tempted to jump in and go, oh my God, that looks really nice, or that aspect looks really great. And I like the way you, in your sketch, you kind of echoed the service tower of Trellic. Like, and then I stopped myself because I was like, no, I don't, you know, we can't give credence to this scheme because it's presented to us as a whole. And if I say I think this is really nice, you're going to take that from me saying I think we should have a 16-story tower block blocking Eden Way off from the rest of the site. Do you see what I mean? So it's preventing us from providing positive feedback to your excellent work.
I think that's exactly
I like to just
I'm just jumping in to kind of emphasize the way I think of it is that this very nice enhanced space has a cost, right? A huge amount of green space, but the cost, one has to consider not just the benefits, but the costs. And the cost is a very large number of housing units and very high density, which has all the aspects which we've talked about, all the consequences and costs which we've talked about. So you can't talk only about benefits, which is what you're trying to tempt us to do here.
I mean, we discussed density last week, and as a proposal, our option of 127 units at the moment, as it stands, is not an overly densified proposal for the area that we're building on. It's not. It isn't.
But Patrick, I'm sorry to interrupt, but what we're hearing from you is we've had a consultation. The residents and the stakeholders and all of us at Comet have given our opinion, and you're saying, but you're wrong.
No, I didn't say that.
You said it's not dense. It's just not.
No, the statement of the site being over-densified in relationship to other schemes and what is considered normal and acceptable is not over-densified. It's not
considered normal and
so.
acceptable by who?
Just on that aspect, it's not overly densified in comparison to what's the norm of a development.
It's overly
not
densified in comparison to the 2015 SPD and the 2019 local plan.
The SPD makes a reference and it says, but okay, we've been over this already.
But it is the nub of the issue.
No, I'm just. It's the issue of the co-design that James has mentioned. Is the first steering group I brought it up. What does co-design really mean? And my interpretation of how this steering group was going to work was we have these workshops on specific points, and then we alter the design as a result of these workshops. That for me, that's co-design. We are listening on specific points and then going to make amendments. That's how I assumed it was going to work. I mean, I brought it up. The very first steering group meeting, I said, what does co-design mean? Because it can mean an array of different things.
But I guess that, you know, the difficulty we have here is that all our feedback on what you've presented us today is we cannot pay for all this space with higher density. That's the one piece of feedback. And if you want to hear it over and over and over again, it's the only point we're going to make.
Okay. Well, I was hoping that you'd make a point on one topic, then each meeting we have every week, we would discuss a different aspect. And then after the end of this round of steering group meetings, we go away and see how we can take on board and change the design as a result of the meetings. It's not going to happen. We're not going to have a meeting one week and then make changes the next week and then have another meeting and then make change. We were supposed to have a specific topic for each meeting. Then the end of the five meetings, we go away and we make changes. Then we start this steering group again and we discuss, this is what we've done to address your points.
But Patrick, you're in asking us to engage upon proposed plans for the community spaces and public realm. You're asking us to accept the premise of your proposal in terms of density and layout.
Not necessarily, because you've made the point that you think that it's over. You feel that it's over densified. I didn't say that. You've made that point.
Yeah, but we're now on to discussing what would we like to see in the public realm within the parameters set by your current proposed plan.
I guess that's the clarification of we last week you set your position out on density clearly, and that's complete border. That's established. It's on record. That's something that will be, as Patrick said, will be considered. We understand. You made it clear again today that any feedback you provide on this scheme is counterbalanced by your position on density. Now, that's not to say I'm sure people still have views on any scheme is going to involve landscape and public realm improvements. It's required by policy, and it wouldn't be good design if it didn't. So to try and move on from here, there's still got to be feedback that you as a group can provide that can influence the design.
I totally accept that. I think the problem again is one of trust, because if you look at the way the feedback and consultation has been designed so far, right? In phase one, we slightly naively engaged hugely on what would we like to see in terms of green space. Would we like increased green space? Yes, of course we would like increased green space. And then, you know, we end up with this very kind of dense and tall structure that cuts the estate in two in phase proposal in phase 2. And then if you look at the feedback form and the way that's structured, it's like, you know, do you strongly agree or strongly object to having increased green space on the site? And then not until like right at the end of it do you get, would you like 20, 18 or 16 stories? So we constantly feel like we're being railroaded into something with kind of positive things, into having something that we don't want.
And I guess that's the purpose of these sessions, is to try and strip away the very simplistic feedback form process, and it's trying to get the actual feedback on issues at a smaller scale on individual topic basis, so that the next stage of consultation can reflect that better. And I think that's and completely understand that you have concerns about commenting on this scheme, but at the moment we have to have a point of reference and help. Like if we didn't have the scheme, you wouldn't then necessarily have thought it was over dense, if that's clear. So by having the scheme, you've black and white set out your position on it. And similarly with open space and other points, it's drawn out issues that are clear as a result. So yeah, it's difficult to suggest how to move on that basis. I guess what do you want to, having set out your position, what do you want to discuss more?
Maybe we can, you know, we can talk a little bit about what we think that public realm space, or the you know, what the things that you've touched on. Maybe we can say something about what we think they ought to be. So, for example, we think the podium should be reinstated. We think that the space under the podium should be used for revenue generation. We think that the ball court, we're very open to your ideas of moving the ball court to the north of the tower, but we think the top of the podium should be landscaped as in the original. That the kind of feedback you're interested in?
Yeah, I think that's really, really valuable. And I do appreciate what you're saying about the salami slice, and it's a good kind of indicator of where we've set out set up these sessions and the different kind of topics. But I wouldn't say that kind of comments you've made on one kind of slice at all devalue those you've made on another, kind of in the sense, kind of if you're commenting on the community uses, you're almost commenting also on the SPD and the local plan, which has a requirement for that, and responding to that. So that's going to apply to kind of whatever iteration of the scheme. And that's also true for the kind of the key routes and the kind of landscape connections. So we can discuss it kind of in those terms as well. And that feedback is kind of it's kind of in isolation, I guess. I think that's the way these kind of the intention of these meetings structured in this way kind of was agreed. But obviously I appreciate kind of your point as well.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the kind of connectivity on the estate, which we talked a lot about, we've heard a lot about in this session. You know, visual connectivity is also very important, as it says in the heritage listing. You know, that there's a strong visual connection between the blocks and the houses on Edenham Way and Trellic Tower, blocks A and B. It specifically states that in the heritage listing. And I know, again, this strays away from your landscaping, from the landscaping topics here, but you know, what for I think everyone on the Edenham Way side of the estate is a real hard red line objection, is this complete visual cutoff that we're going to have from the rest of the estate, right? So no one in block, like I won't be able to see block B, and block B will not be able to see me. No one in blocks C or E will be able to see Trellic Tower. And only people above a certain height in Trellic Tower will be able to see blocks C and E. So that visual connectivity that holds this estate together, that was part of Goldfinger's original vision, is gone. And that, I think, makes it very hard to engage on the rest of some of the nice landscaping ideas you've got, because it's predicated on that visual section.
No, I think that's an important point, and I think it's also kind of important to consider kind of, yes, this scheme is kind of earmarked for development, that those views and those connections will change, and it's how they can also be kind of positive, and what are the new relationships that we're creating, because we're obviously very conscious of kind of creating the new interventions that kind of form a new part of that fabric and that estate, and that all makes sense.
Yeah, but we don't feel like we're creating new relationships by being visually cut off from the rest of the estate.
And I think obviously the new blocks kind of will become part of the estate if so.
Right, so we're forming a new relationship with a Howard Tompkins block as opposed to with a Goldfinger, while losing a relationship with a Goldfinger block.
I mean, there will be, I mean, that's the nature of kind of what the development on the site. So yes, those relationships and those views will change and kind of transform, and it's up to kind of this group as well, and kind of us as designers as to kind of how we manage and how we design those to best kind of fulfill the really complex kind of conditions that we're working in.
So I think that the Comet on the whole likes the original Goldfinger design a great deal, and on the whole we're keen on something which is pretty true to that, and that concentrates the housing units on the site of the old people's home.
You know, we're happy to have a new relationship with the fantastic work that Howard Tompkins can do, because we know you can do fantastic work, but we're not happy for that to come at the expense of our relationship with what is currently on the estate, right? So while you're preserving the view from the south for those who don't live on the estate, for a very large number of people, 100 dwellings who live on the eastern part of the estate, you're severing that relationship. And I just want to quote to you from the reasons for the designation on Historic England. It says, group value, the houses and flats form and that's talking about the flats in block C and E, form an integral part of the original design and have a strong visual as well as social unity with Trellic Tower, and the scheme as a whole ranks as Goldfinger's finest work. So what we really fear is that the scheme as a whole, ranking amongst Goldfinger's finest works, is cut in two by this current proposal.
So Gabriel, it's Mark. I think we all appreciate collectively that the concerns that you raised. Hopefully you can hear me properly. Yeah, and I think that what we're trying to do here through these workshops, as Patrick has outlined, is pick out areas where we have to sort of that we have to provide from a planning perspective, almost as part of any proposals. Totally understand that density and height are, and indeed that sort of the eastern block are fundamental concerns to you and others. So I think what we've been trying to do in today is look at these component parts. We're not trying to dance away from the fundamentals or the density, because appreciate entirely that is part of the co-working exercise. But there are things which we will be required to do, as Dan has outlined, which will have to be a component part of any scheme, regardless of its density. So we're sort of trying to hit some of those.
I totally appreciate that, Martin, and we really want to work with you on that. But I would also like to point out that the first thing that you cited in today's presentation as a planning requirement was the 2015 SPD. And just in case we weren't clear on what it was before, because I feel like Joe Sutherland slightly cherry-picked the word may when we discussed it in the first meeting. The 2015 SPD, which you cite as your first planning requirement in this session, states, paragraph 3.24, the new housing should be broadly consistent in scale with that of the Edenham estate. It should be clearly subservient in scale to Block B, so that's 7 stories, not overly dominating the low-rise buildings of Edenham Way, right? So that is not a subjective indication from the SPD. That's very clear. right? It says the scale of the development must respect the existing buildings on the site, and then specifically states 4 to 6 stories. So I think we need to be clear that if you're citing the 2015 SPD in terms of the mixture of use and social good as a planning requirement, you also need to, you can't in the same breath then say, well, actually, we've moved on from the 2015 SPD when it comes to height and density.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just on the SPD, Joe was quoting the bit on the proposals of 4 to 6 stories may be appropriate and what I was saying. And I take on board your point with the SPD, and as a planning consultant, there's so much policy across both documents that all are married, and to set it out in the way that it's our responsibility is to develop a scheme that we think can get planning approval. The degree to which our scheme complies with that policy isn't determined by us, it'll be determined by the authority. And I guess the point to highlight here is that there's so much policy across the 2015 SPD, the 2019 local plan, the London plan, all of which conflict. Some support some elements, some conflict with other elements, and it is a balancing act. And I guess that's the point we're trying to make, is the community, if your position's clear, the policy is numerous and not necessarily clear. And for instance, on that SPD, that has a residential block closer to the back of your properties on the Edenham Way than the block we're proposing. Obviously, that doesn't say what height that block is, but even the fact, just to make a point, that the SPD is, it talks about there's connections, but then sets a block directly up against the back of the gardens of the existing building. So it is really a balancing act across everything.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, we have discussed these points in the last session, and the elements from the SPD that we're discussing today are kind of C and D, which are the open space and the kind of the public realm and amenity, as kind of discrete items.
Yeah, my point was more a sort of general one, that you can't sort of state that we need to hit these things in the SPD as a planning requirement when you're talking about public realm, but then dismiss them when you're talking about height and density.
Well, I'm not saying we need to hit them. I guess it's just kind of that we need to discuss them. So those are the topics to discuss.
I think, Gabriel, what I think we're all collectively trying to say, there genuinely is a will to work with you and get to a balance, as has been described, between what everyone wants to see. We obviously we need to try and drive as many new homes as we can, but we also respect what you've said. There are certain key components that have been discussed. And I use examples for which are the easier ones to hit, like the Muse, that block there, and also possibly the community space, in terms of establishing some of those things which form components. Then the open space, the other elements, if you will, in terms of massing, height, and the number of residential units, are those the vacant Laurie Park site and the eastern section nearest to Edenham Way, and it's playing around with those elements, and also looking at the effect on the removal of graffiti wall and replacement elsewhere. That has to be looked at, and it's part of that co-working exercise. That's what we really need to try and work at. And it is probably going to be quite sort of frustrating to a degree to get to for a while, but we need to find out the solutions and the balance there between us, I think.
Can I just very briefly to that, roughly outline what I think a kind of what Comet thinks. I've said some of this, but let me say it in this context. We think that the podium should be reinstated. We think that the top of the podium should be as in the original a green space. We're very open to the idea of moving the ball court to the north of Trellic. We think that we therefore don't think that your idea of those residential Muse houses is a good idea. We prefer the idea of making the most of the space under the podium for commercial uses. We think that the graffiti wall, that this scheme allows the preservation of the performance space, so the heart of the beach, plus the long sections of the graffiti wall and the eastern, so everything except for the piece that's under the podium essentially is preserved in our view, and as is the performance space. So the kind of heart of the current use is preserved, and we then see the top of the podium being green space play area. So many of the ideas that you have one level down being on the podium, and then we see a reduction in the total amount of green space, particularly given that Meanwhile is there and has the capacity for greater use and for play areas, etc. And we see massing of housing units on the existing car park site stroke the old people's home. So that, broadly speaking, is our the feedback that we have on what you've shown us.
And just to reiterate, and that the design approach, the landscape architecture, if that we're discussing, it seems strange that the landscape architects aren't there to sort of discuss the scheme with us, but should be one that adopts an attitude towards a restorative, urbanly oriented approach, rather than one which is vested in sort of greenery, which Meanwhile fundamentally has. Whereas there's a very unique urban condition at the beach level, which is sort of endemic and seriously endangered in public urban space, which is invested, which we see in arts like graffiti, which are an endangered species, only protected in spaces where, like East London, where it's sort of for the purposes of corporate gain. Whereas here you have something totally unique, which would probably be beneficial to a housing scheme like this anyway. So it's a restorative attitude rather than cleaning up and eradicating and then replacing new attitude. It is inherently aligned with the processes of conservation, which should be thought of as first principles on a site like this, not rip it up, start again, move, remake.
James, just listen to what you've said, which you made very clear. I think what you said, what Tony said, and I have to sort of hold my hands up. I wasn't at the last meeting, so I apologise to those that were, obviously, and I wasn't. So I don't want to be sort of off piece. But what's been said, just rounding it off, is that space at the base of the tower, graffiti walls at the base of the tower, you would prefer to see a removal of the residential units within that, and a design approach found that can utilize that space, because clearly the space that is behind that at the moment is in need of structural repairs and is a multi-story car park. So you have to reconfigure that in some fashion, point one. And so that is a fairly straightforward one. I think it seems to me that the western end of the site, in terms of the Mews approach and some residential, is generally welcomed. You're talking about the space in the centre of the site, perhaps not having quite as much green space as currently is envisaged, and retaining the feel of the sort of that feel that you've got there at the moment, if I'm reading it correctly. So from our point of view, then you're also talking optimizing the density on the Lorry Park site, which I know has challenges in terms of English heritage and others who have views about the views from the south. So what we have, our challenge is to balance the eastern end of the site, where there is graffiti wall at the present time, and also consider the views that have been expressed about the height and density on that element of the site, to try and find a solution that gives us, hopefully, a satisfactory number of units to make the whole scheme work, and addressing the points you've just made. Is that kind of, in a very, very, very crude form, about right?
I think that's a very fair summary, Martin.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally.
I guess and I'm really positive that there's interaction there. I guess the playing devil's advocate in terms of if development isn't in that northern part of the site, and we're then talking about the car park site alone, even 60 units, correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, but we're talking about 4 to 6 stories that you've referenced in the SPD and the locations of blocks there. I'm just conscious of, Gabriel, your point about visual connectivity. If you have even if a 6-story block was in the location that's shown in the SPD, there's already a conflict there. And this is kind of highlighting the point that we're battling with throughout this design process of even a simple statement as agreement that we've reached there already raises a potential conflict of if development is solely located on the car park site and is a minimum of 60 units as required, then there's already a conflict in terms of visual connectivity. Not to say this can't be addressed, but I'm just flagging as an example the conflict that there is.
Has the and Sarah, maybe you know the answer to this. I mean, has that work been done? I mean, did you run an exercise whereby you just built on the area of the former old people's home and stuck to the 2015 excuse me, SPD height of 4 to 6 stories?
I mean, we've run a variety of kind of site strategies that we tried to get through and didn't manage to complete in that first session. So that might be kind of something that we can revisit, kind of explaining those options and how we kind of reach this site strategy again. I don't think we've kind of done justice in our kind of presentation to the like kind of degree of that process, if I'm honest.
Can I be clear, just because I don't want to sort of be unclear afterwards? What I've said was, in terms of the eastern end of the site, my view was that to have a sort of balance, we would actually still have to use that area, and that which means losing some graffiti wall. But then it's about the height and massing that you adopt in that area alongside the development of the lorry park site. So I'm quite clear on that point.
In our sort of worded proposal, the areas of graffiti wall which are the most important, and that's the wrong word, but that we see as the ones that are last sort of stand in terms of their importance, so to speak, are the ones to the eastern side, the long reaches which are open and have significant sort of artistic real estate, so to speak.
Can I ask a question? Because I think it's a really interesting kind of point that I've been grappling with about the kind of the nature of the graffiti kind of uses and its kind of adjacency to residential. So obviously kind of we're going to increase the kind of capacity to whatever degree of residential kind of accommodation on that site, which will change the nature and character of the site, and just kind of what you kind of, I know we've heard from the graffiti writers, but to hear from other members of Comet and the wider community about how you see that, and obviously kind of making the that open space more inclusive and kind of more accessible as well. How you see that kind of working, regardless of kind of whatever plan is drawn, just those uses kind of in isolation.
Well, I can speak as a resident and a father of a child who's just under 3. I was in that space on Saturday morning, Sunday morning, one of those mornings. Sunny day. I don't think the graffiti writers had arrived yet, but if they had, you know, it would have been really interesting for her. I think the issue with the space, if there is an issue, is about kind of accessibility and people's ability to get there, and perhaps the overlooking. But what I find really interesting, and I know that my 2.5-year-old daughter finds really interesting, is watching the graffiti happen. And there's currently a massive owl on the northeastern corner of the place. She absolutely loves that. You know, that this we don't all need to be funneled into a sort of cookie cutter playground that comes from a playground manufacturer. That there is something really positive and unique about this space, that I don't write graffiti, neither does my daughter, but we use it. And if it were more accessible and easier to overlook, I think we'd all love it.
No, I think that's right. And it's about the kind of the nature of play spaces. You're right. Kind of, it gives you the shivers when you walk past a park and it's just like thousands of parents standing around the kids. You just think like, oh God, it's Saturday morning. I agree with that. And the nature of kind of play and how that can be designed into the proposals, I think is really important. Like, what actually are the spaces that kind of you need, and how will they be used, and how are they intended to be used?
It's worth saying that actually there are several very nice play spaces very close by in Meanwhile, and I hope that you use them, Gabriel. When you
I do. we can take this offline, but yeah, the play hut would open.
I mean, in terms of this sort of co-working idea, and I think hopefully we are having and trying to make some progress here. I think that as we've said, it's a balance, because if we will listen to what you have to say and try and find a solution that addresses those. But we from our side also have to have some ability to achieve our objectives as well.
Yeah, we totally understand that. I guess that what we haven't understood is what the red
need to
lines
do, so that we can try and, as we said, make some progress in meeting the minds.
Sorry, Martin, you dropped out again. Would you mind repeating?
So I think what I'm trying to say is that we understand, and sorry, my internet connection is terrible this afternoon, but we in order to make the progress, which I think we're all trying to achieve, we've listened to what you've had to say, and it's give and take a little bit, because we understand what you're trying to achieve, but we have objectives as well that we have to achieve. It's finding that balance, because we will not be able to, I don't personally believe that we'll be able to meet the sort of housing need that we have solely on the Lorry Park site. We will have to look at elements of eastern elements of the well, but it's how those are addressed appropriately to sort of to meet the needs of those that live there, and make sure the graffiti artists are satisfied with the public art spaces that remain, etc. It's that balance that we'll have to try and achieve, I think, then in working up some very basic designs principles.
I was just going to say, Martin, I completely agree and understand. I guess that what on our side we don't have any indication of is what your actual red lines are on your needs, because it's striking that Kim Taylor-Smith said, "Oh yeah, 16 stories. That was an opening gambit. The total number of homes, right? It's very difficult to conduct this as a rational conversation when there's a negotiating framework like that. We don't know what your absolute need is in terms of homes on that site."
Well, it's I think this is part of the problem, because it's not a finite. I mean, I think we've outlined previously in other meetings what our aspirations are within the overall program, and the fact that this is one of the more significant sites. And that's what we're trying to sort of find a meeting the minds on. We had the facts of the matter are we have secured GLA grant for I think 64 homes, which is a significant amount of money to anyone. It's £100,000 a unit. We'd like to try and optimize that, but we also have to balance that with other tenures in there, whether it be key worker as well as some open market rent, to make it a proper mixed tenure community as it is at present. So it's finding that balance that we have to try and achieve together, really. And I know we've already demonstrated it's not easy.
So totally agree. And I'd just like to say that actually, in today's conversation, I feel like we're feeling our way towards a more collaborative approach. I do feel like we are kind of edging towards it. We're having a conversation, we're hearing each other, and I appreciate that. I hope we can go further. What I was wondering, Sarah, is have you run an exercise, for example, that says what could you achieve if you just built on the site of the old people's home and you didn't go over 6 stories? What could you achieve in terms of numbers of units in a good way? Like, have you done that creative exercise?
I think the feasibility kind of strategies that we looked at a very early stage, but obviously we've gone through the kind of the constraints, being kind of particular one from an early point, being that key view from the south, and keeping from a heritage perspective that is a constraint from there, and the level of development kind of that suggests that hasn't been pursued, because like Martin says, it's not kind of meeting the kind of even the minimum levels, because of that particular tension.
Can I just be very clear? So you're saying that from your drawings, it's impossible to get a minimum of 60 units on the area of the former old people's home while not building over 6 stories?
Well, I think if you were to build 6 stories, for example, over the whole site, then you could kind of deliver a significant of the whole of that kind of part of the site. You could deliver a significant number of homes at whatever density, but with the constraints of kind of actually good quality development that kind of makes sense from an urban kind of point of view, as well as the heritage constraints, like that view from the south and actually minimizing height. The SPD doesn't kind of consider that, but that is something we need to consider. So actually kind of that 3-story block that we're proposing along Elkstone Road, we feel is the maximum kind of comfortable in order to kind of maintain that, and that's attention, and that's kind of again offsetting kind of the tallness of the tower, and that allows kind of us to respond to those other constraints. So obviously that kind of drives up kind of why height is kind of the in this kind of strategic solution.
And I guess, Sarah, just to jump in, it's not Howard Tompkins that have made the decision that 3 stories there is acceptable in a heritage concept. That's Historic England saying, and his 20th Centuries are saying, if you build on that strip, if you think of a view of Trellic Tower, if you build on that strip above 3 stories, then there will be a harmful impact. So it's kind of, and similarly, if you had another 2 blocks, then that cuts that separation. So this is trying to communicate the process that we go through. You kind of start with this blank piece of paper, and then you keep cutting slices out of it, and then you cut slices from the side, and you'll end up with these areas where Historic England are happy with the impact on Trellic Tower or on the estate, other listed parts of the estate, and then it's all maneuvering from there. And I guess the other party that we have to throw in here is, and this is what we're managing from lots of different sides, is the planning department. And they've been clear in discussions that not to address some of the issues in other parts of the estate, so the lack of accessibility and other points, would not be a beneficial development, because if you turn your back on some elements of the scheme, then just taking a small part of it in isolation doesn't realize the benefit that could potentially manifest itself.
But you can imagine a world in which you can address the accessibility of what is currently the graffiti wall without building an 8-story block on top of it.
Yeah, and then again, this is, but then that then takes into account other parts. So yeah, just again, I think like everyone said today, it's been beneficial in heading a better direction. And I think you'll appreciate the position that, well, not me, because I can't design to save my life, but the architects as a
I really appreciate that position.
Yeah.
I really, really do appreciate that position. What I'm trying to get a clear answer to, and I don't think I've quite got it, is has there been a process whereby the architects have been asked, what could you do in a clever way within the constraints of not building over 6 stories on the area of the old people's home, in terms of units, but also in terms of good architecture and good public space, etc. Has that process been done, or has it not?
The answer, I'm not the architect either, because I'm a crap designer, but I think the answer would probably be, Gabriel, if I'm hopefully being transparent here, for the reasons that have been outlined, we have to comply with what English heritage and 20th century society say. So that has been taken away to inform how it's been approached. I mean, I think that there's an argument that could say, well, all right, perhaps we all have to do a bit of push and pull. So we can look at maybe slightly increasing the height and the design on the on the Elkstone Road site. But personally, I feel it's very unlikely that we would be able to get away without doing something on the eastern element of the site.
No, I'm not saying you shouldn't do anything on the eastern element. Forgive me for interrupting, but you're making it sound like English Heritage and the 20th Century Society are happy with the current proposal, which they're not. But B, I'm just trying to get an answer to the question, and I don't mean this in a confrontational way. I mean in a positive and constructive way. If we were to go to the architects with the brief saying, what could you do in terms of good architecture, good use of public space, if you built not over 6 stories on the area of the former old people's home, has that exercise been done? And if not, could we do it?
I'm not sure, Patrick and Sarah, what instructions have been issued in that regard, but I don't think, I mean, could you just perhaps answer that question, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can I think we should go back through the site strategy kind of options, because I think it would really help kind of now everyone's kind of got an understanding of kind of our approach and the complexity surrounding actually to be able to go through those options and understand really why each one was discounted. And how
when you say each one was discounted, that makes us feel like we're funneled back into a 16-story and an 8-story block on the
not at all. It's understanding the process, and I can see that, and that's kind of, I guess, it's understanding the decision-making process we have taken kind of to this point. And you should the point of this thing, this kind of forum, is that you're party to that decision making, and that at the end kind of then we're able to evaluate the kind of the current proposals kind of collectively, and it's not kind of finding issue with each one kind of, or everyone kind of getting their, I don't know, having their opinions on each one. It's almost kind of just following the process, appreciating kind of the process that's been done, and us having kind of the opportunity to explain that. And then from that point, we can, like, once you've kind of got the whole salami, then we can kind of go from there, I think is the point. But James, you had a point.
Yeah, can I propose a motion? We've been talking a lot about heritage today, and it feels like it feels slightly unfair on both representatives from Historic England and the 20th Century Society that we're sort of discussing their views without them being in the room. May I propose that representatives from either body are invited to our heritage session? Because I'm really interested in this perception of what heritage is, you know, and I think that particularly 20th Century Society, with whom I have some close connections, I'm interested in this sort of fixity, which is about views, as if all buildings should be treated like St. Paul's, when in fact heritage is an extremely dynamic and changing definition, especially in the contemporary gaze, considering, you know, lots of what the mayor's been saying about monuments, etc., of which there are some critical ones on the site, which are monuments even in the contemporary gaze, which we haven't discussed, and I don't think we should go to here. But I'm quite interested in having a roundtable potentially with heritage officials, us as a community, and you guys as the professional expertise delivering what should be the next Heritage Prize winning scheme, to really discuss this notion of heritage that surrounds the site, because I think it's being used as a sort of analog, I think, at this point, and I'd rather we created a more nuanced definition of what heritage is, because this is such an important space, and from a heritage perspective, and I think heritage is about Meanwhile Gardens heritage as a collective piece of public art. It's about Josephine and all the graffiti writers' cultural appropriation of the space since the 1980s. Heritage is about Goldfinger's vision that started in the 1970s. It's a dynamic continuum. It is not going back or using any kind of euphemistic. And I fundamentally believe that the heritage bodies also see that. So I think what we should do is sit in the room together and have a discussion about that, and therefore define what is our collective attitude towards heritage approach, because I think it's more nuanced.
Can I'll just throw this out there? This is not sort of saying we have to do this, but just my sort of initial thoughts when I've worked with these sort of schemes before. I think that discussion with heritage would probably be more constructive and likely to get some outcomes if some examples of sort of what the alternatives might be, which we could collectively discuss as a group with the steering group, and then sort of basically, you know, look at the options that we collectively feel may be options that we could all buy into, and then put them in front of the heritage guys or ladies, because then you'll actually get an outcome and a more decision-based thing rather than, you know, waffling around.
Also, they charge per meeting, Historic England and 20th Century Society, so and they're very difficult to get slots with. So yeah, I think.
But no, James, I think is a really important point, and the thematic kind of idea, the notion of heritage, what it means, kind of historic kind of heritage, like what it means to different kind of groups within this community, would be a really interesting discussion to have, and I think that would be extremely valuable. So I mean, regardless of whether kind of Historic England 20th Century are able to attend, that's would be a really interesting discussion.
And I guess the point in terms of developing that scheme is those red lines that you talked about, Tony, in terms of Comet's red lines and the council's red lines. And I guess the key red line from the council is the point we touched on last week in terms of viability and the number of units. And I know that there's still discussion to be had on us presenting that information to you, but I think that is a really important consideration in terms of defining what the design of the site looks like, because there is that underlying number.
Yeah, totally agree. And part of our concern, I guess, with a lot of what's been presented today, hence my continually insisting about why is it affordable rather than commercial space under the podium, is precisely that we don't want to feel that the amenity spaces are being paid for in lots of market units.
Yeah, I can completely take that on board, and again, it's this balancing act of, you were talking, say, if you had commercial office space in there, that wouldn't be a community use, and that then conflicts with planning, and it's a round circle. But yeah, I think there's red lines there, but at the same time, that has to reflect the fact that if the tenant was then lost from it, then it needs to kind of balance itself out. So it's just careful about what the use is in there, and that's why the use isn't defined, because it has to be informed. And the council have been telling us this constantly. We want a use in there that is viable and sustainable, and that's the key. And that means commercially viable as well as viable in terms of what it provides for the community.
I think to a degree it's also shaping these spaces, because we can, to a degree, once we understand what goes where, sort of thing, then we can actually figure out what's the best use to go inside it, and whilst that would inform the viability, we're not being driven entirely by saying, oh well, we have to do X, Y, and Z to pay for the green space, because we've got no money coming in on the community space. I think there's a number of different dynamics and the way the numbers work, which we can look at in more detail. But I think we've got to go back to some of these basics and get some of these key principles established, and what works for everyone, just by simple drawings. I know how Tompkins take great pride in showing fantastic work to everyone. I think it's almost showing some quite basic things to demonstrate what the outputs of that would be, so that we can get some progress on those, and then they can be developed into more shiny, beautiful drawings, sort of thing.
Thank you, Martin. I'm just going to interject there and call the meeting to a close, if that's okay. I think, much like with the viability work, there's some meetings to be had offline afterwards that can be organised, and some more documents to be shared ahead of next week, and some further conversations to be had. But yeah, thank everyone for coming yet again. And like with the previous meetings, we'll endeavour to get this onto YouTube as quickly as possible. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Thank you, everybody.
Cheers. Thanks.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Cheers.